Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in just a moment. Thanks for joining. I want to take a moment to read a few image descriptions of the slides that uh, are being presented. First image description, light brown background with white, orange, and bright purple flowers surrounding text that reads, "The WRC presents Creating Feminist Futures Conversation Series, Dismantling Carceral Logic with Claire Barrera and Babatunde Azubike. Join in via Zoom October 8th, 2020, 4:30 to 6 p.m. PST. Register at bit.ly CFF Series 1 at PSU_WRC. Our other image description reads gradient purple background behind a red circle with black text that reads, "The WRC presents Creating Feminist Futures, a conversation on Black feminism with Ebony Oldham and Naima Lowe on 10/13/2020, 5:30 to 7 p.m. PST. On Zoom, register at bit.ly CFF Series 2 at PSU_WRC. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I know a lot of folks will be joining us shortly. I wanted to take a moment to just say hello to everyone. My name is Alicia Howard. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the coordinator for the Sexual and Relationship Violence Response Program and a confidential advocate at the Women's Resource Center at Portland State University. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this Creating Feminist Futures conversation series tonight with Claire and Babatunde um, to talk about dismantling carceral logic. I want to briefly take a moment to honor uh, the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Bands the Chinook, Tualatin, Wapato, Kalapuya, Molalla, and other tribes along the Columbia River whose land we occupy. We thank the descendants of these tribes for being the original stewards of this land and the protectors of this land. And we consider ourselves to be honored guests. And now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers for this evening. We have uh, with us Claire Barrera, who we're so excited to have Again, we had Claire with us during Sexual Assault Awareness Month earlier this April. And so glad to have them with us again. I'm going to briefly read their bio. Claire Barrera is an artist, activist, and educator based in Portland, Oregon. They have participated in anti-violence movements for over 2 decades, focusing on healing, transformative, and racial justice. Currently, they work with El Programa Hispano, organized with Brown Girl Rise. Their book, When Language Runs Dry, was published by Mend My Dress Press in 2020. A forthcoming dance project focusing on a play as a site of discipline and transformation will be presented in spring of 2020. Please help me welcome Claire Barrera. And you can feel free to give some reactions, silent snaps if you'd like. And also joining us is Babatunde Azubike. Babatunde is a Black Afro-Indigenous, queer two-spirit disabled Southern femme from Athens, Georgia. Z is the executive director of Black and Beyond the Binary Collective and the founder of Umoja Kijana Shuja. Is it Shuja? Shuja, okay, sorry. The Umoja Kijana Shuja program, raised in a working class household, guided her mother. The fight for liberation is nothing new to her. Babatunde first began organizing for survival after being fired from coming out as transgender. Z believes healing is key to take down opponents of the carceral state. In her free time, Babatunde is a chef, cat parent, which we just saw not too long ago, and a student of generative somatics. Your vision is guided by a body positive abolitionist, pro-Palestine, intersectional Black queer feminism. Say that 5 times fast. So yes, please silent snaps. We'd love to see your reactions to welcome these two in our conversation this evening. And I'll leave it up to you all.
Thanks, Alicia. I feel really honored to be here. And I was getting a chance to talk with Babatunde a little bit before this event started. And I'm open to where you want to start, Babatunde, but I definitely was interested in hearing more about like what led you. I want to hear more about the work you do now, but I'm also just curious about what led you to doing some of the types of work you do, which when I was listening to your bio, I'm like, oh, all these things really like interconnect in really awesome ways, like body related work and class struggle and Black feminism and all these things. So yeah, what do you see as like the roots of what brought you to where you are now, if you want to start there?
Yeah. Also, thanks for y'all for having me. But I think most of my work has been guided by my lived experiences. A lot of those have been grounded, as was mentioned. You know, I'm from the South. I was raised by very strong Black women. So I think that's definitely kind of the platform that I come to this work with. I think just my experiences in this lifetime, in this body, really, I feel like living all of the alphabet soups at some point have been all of the spectrums, like LGBT, you know, all of the things. So I think that's part of it too. And I got, after, you know, coming out in my early 20s, like, you know, being in the deep South, you know, really easy for folks to find reasons to get rid of you when they don't like your skin tone or your gender identity or your sexuality. And unfortunately, that happened to me. And it's the case of a lot of folks that I know, especially back home. Um, and I really came into this work, honestly, at one of the lowest points in my life where I had no way to provide for myself. Um, I had no money, no job, and decided to just link up with folks who had resources, which really were other youth, LGBTQ folks, other Black folks who were doing organizing. So really just kind of like cut my teeth with that and have been organizing ever since. It's been like about a decade now. Um, and I think just living within, holding a lot of different intersectional identities, um, being Black and also being Native as well is complex in and of itself. Um, I think also living as a disabled person and really like owning that and becoming like politically disabled as well has been like completely transformative. But yeah, a lot of different things have kind of brought me here, but I think that the biggest piece of that is just really getting a lot of tenderness, compassion, and the teaching from folks who have been around the movement longer than I have. Um, which is another reason like elders are so it's so important, but like that's definitely one of the reasons. It's just like a lot of love and compassion from elders to kind of teach me the ways and all that good stuff. So yeah, that's what leads me to youth work. I'm like, I want to do what somebody did for me, like bring you along, and then lifting up people always. um yeah, I'd like to hear about like what brought you into your work as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, for me, it's lived experience. I think it's a combination of lived experience, um, and witnessing. So, I grew up partly some of my childhood in rural Montana, and some of my childhood in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, which was a really interesting mix. In Montana, my family, which is a mixed race family, my mom's white, my dad's Chicano, um, being like a young queer person of color in a town where there were very few people of color and nobody else who was out as queer, was really challenging. And when I was kind of thinking about this event and some of the questions that Alicia shared with us ahead of time, I was thinking about how school is often like one of the earliest places that carceral logic shows up. And I feel like for me, that was very much the case. I also had really wonderful and supportive parents, still do. They're both still alive. So my mom, was a very passionate feminist. My dad was like a huge feminist and activist too. When he and I lived in DC, we did a lot of like AIDS related protesting when I was a kid. So I had this experience of like having a really strong, supportive home, where my identities were really celebrated in a lot of ways, which was a huge privilege and blessing. But having experiences starting really young of school being a place where punishment occurred for disproportionately for some people than others. And I think between having a family that like really nurtured my eye for injustice and then experiencing and witnessing a lot of injustice in school, that spark in me started very young. My mom went back to school to become a social worker when I was around 9 and eventually ended up working in the domestic violence shelter in our town. And I think like a lot of rural areas, things are done a little differently. So I went to work with her all the time. There wasn't confidentiality concerns with me going to work with her, which was really wonderful in a lot of ways. So I like, as a teenager, like took care of all the kids during her support groups and would just hang out with her and stuff envelopes or organize her files for her, and saw really early like what a strong community the community was to end violence. And so that became a really obvious place for me early on that seemed accessible. I think sometimes domestic violence and sexual assault movements have their own share of issues as they've been professionalized, but I think compared to some other social services areas, there's more of a tradition of the movement being led by and for survivors. And that was definitely the case in my town. And so it seemed like a very accessible world to me as I got older and was trying to figure out where I wanted to put my energy. So that was also a big root or influence for me. And sort of like you, it was primarily working with youth for a long time. Now it's more diverse, but maybe partly because of those experiences as a young person, I saw that as like a place where I wanted to help the most, was by doing work with youth. Is that something sort of like the way carceral logic shows up in school systems that you experienced or that you've witnessed with young people that you've been organizing with?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think it's been a while since I've been in school, but I think back to my own experiences, and my entire life, I've definitely been visibly queer. And school was definitely one of the first places where it was like, oh, not only are you going to be treated differently because of your skin color, but also because of your perceived gender or sexuality. You know what I'm saying? And so I definitely had a lot of challenges growing up, and I think it almost led to me not graduating high school, because it's just like too much. It's like I can do bad all by myself, like Medea says, like, you know. But with the youth that I work with specifically, a lot of them are from East County, and consistently what we've seen is like young Black femmes uh, are disciplined at much, much higher levels. I mean, it's kind of like absurd, like some of the stories that I've heard. And I think alongside that too, there has been recent conversations around a lot of sexual violence that has happened in some of the schools as well. And so I think it's really, exciting that so many young folks are like joining to kind of like, you know, find solutions to obviously their own problems, but problems that they're experiencing, but the administration is not really addressing them, So now it becomes like a conversation of like, okay, well, where's the disconnect, because like these reports are happening. People are talking about the experiences that are impacting them, and it's being met with dismissal or punishment for speaking up, which is, usually the case for survivors, unfortunately. And I think that, yeah, it's just like a really, really challenging experience, I'm sure, for like the young folks, like to be in this middle of this movement, with Black Lives Matter and, everybody hopping on to like defund and we love our Black folks, and still like the policies and practices don't reflect that. And there's a lot of cognitive dissonance that's happening there.
Yeah, I agree. And I think sometimes, I think justice and healing are complex for any survivor. I've noticed in my work with youth survivors that there's an even stronger desire among youth to have alternatives to the criminal justice system, partly because for youth, it's so often someone close to them that has been the harmer in whatever scenario. And youth have a complex relationship to that person who's harming that might include love and need and dependence, in addition to anger and a need for accountability. And yet alternatives and justice in general, whether it's carceral or transformative justice, are even less accessible to youth than anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
because of the amount of laws we have that are supposedly there to protect youth, but often end up criminalizing youth or narrowing their options.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that most of the conversations I think that I've been having with folks is like a lot around like restorative justice and transformative justice, and actually looking at like the whole person who has caused harm, as opposed to just being like, this person is a criminal that committed a crime, you know, which is a joke when state violence happens in every way possible every second, you know? So it's just, again, a lot of cognitive dissonance there that makes it even more challenging for, I feel like, young folks to kind of like filter through a lot of the bullshit essentially to get to the core of like, how can I actually heal? How can I feel like this thing that happened to me is not everything that's about me? How can I you know, I think this conversation, it comes to like, how do I restore? And it's like, you can't necessarily restore, but I think creating more avenues for healing and different healing modalities is really, really key, you know, because every experience is different. Some folks are going to want to do talk therapy. Some folks are wanting to do like a circle, you know, some folks are going to want to just like, here's my demands or my requests, and I don't want to do anything more, you know? So yeah, I think definitely we need more of that in schools, 100%, just to like different, like that's the perfect space I feel like to create opportunities to try different modalities for like smaller things, smaller levels of harm, you know, just to have that practice of that.
Yeah. I think one thing that I've noticed and that I'm hearing a little bit in what you're saying is that even when there's sort of an effort towards restorative justice because that's kind of a hot thing in youth programming nowadays. I went to a conference last year on restorative justice. It was really interesting who was present and how restorative justice only applied among youth, but it didn't apply grown up to youth. So if youth felt harmed by school officials or juvenile justice probation officers or whatever, right? Like it didn't extend to those things, and that this is like a chronic issue with sort of carceral feminism and carceral logic is that there's not an extension of values to like the systems, to like the higher levels. And so while a nonprofit, for example, a domestic and sexual violence nonprofit might have these values of trauma-informed care and equity, that's going to only apply in so much as the system isn't challenged in and of itself. Like that's where the line gets drawn with survivors, is they're like, well, yeah, we'll apply that when we're supporting you around your situation, but if you want to actually question or bring those values to like the way we're doing the work, we're not willing to go there. And I think that's something that youth come up against a lot. And it sounds like maybe some of these youth are coming up against that with regards to like calling the administrations out on how they're not supporting survivors, but that the ears aren't open for that type of restorative justice as well.
Yeah, typically it's like a one-way street, you know, it's like a lot of it is just like trying to just placate people, get folks to like calm down a little bit, you know, like it's really it's dismissive and it's disempowering, and it's like I think it speaks to like the high level of like fatigue for young people, you know, like I think that being young is already hard enough, but then, you know, you are supposed to be in spaces that are created for your safety, for your learning, you know, and those spaces really just become another point of violence, you know, that like you were mentioning earlier. So I think it's like the work that you were doing with like Brown Girl Rise, like I think that it's really important that we create other spaces for young people to be, to practice restorative justice, to practice like naming you caused harm and someone actually being like, I'm sorry I caused that harm. Like, how can I fix it? What do you need? You know? Like, I think that is like, I mean, I think not just young people need that. We all need that, right? Like, I think that we just as a people living on Turtle Island right now, I just the way that the state is set up, like we don't know how to deal with harm. Like we just don't. You know, the system that exists right now, state violence create more violence, you know? Oh, that was so funny. That's what we were getting to. But yeah, I was getting to the point that I feel like state violence creates interpersonal violence, you know, like if we actually think about the reasons that people cause harm, the root causes, a lot of that is lack of access to like medical care, lack of access to like mental health services, economic differences, you know, differences in like education, environmental racism, you know, like all of those things cause interpersonal violence. You know, I think that the state would have us believe that without police and judges and the system, we would just like be killing each other and harming each other constantly. And it's like, actually, if you remove all of these other barriers to like people being able to live full, robust, healthy lives, a lot of that is different. A lot of that would like transform and we'd be living in a much different world right now.
Yeah, I really agree. I think, you know, I've been working at El Programa Hispano for almost 11 years. And so the soup that I'm really swimming in that position is primarily working with undocumented immigrants who are survivors. And the connection between state violence and interpersonal violence is like very easy to draw. And I mean, for one thing, it looks like state violence abroad through neoliberal policies, if not direct invasion or meddling in other countries. So, you know, for many of the survivors that I work with, their violence is occurring because they had to cross a border that they would never have crossed if state violence hadn't occurred, both from the states in their home countries and US violence abroad. And so, you know, so many folks are put at risk of violence because of forced migration, whether it's because they're actually harmed crossing the border or because they've been criminalized as undocumented people, which forces people into shadowy worlds where folks who want to exercise power can take advantage of that. And so that's one way that I see state violence very clearly playing out in the communities that we work with at El Programa Hispano. And in addition, I think that there's a huge criminalization of survivors. You know, my first paid job in social services, I worked in the Bay Area with an organization that provided residential facilities to women coming out of prison who were being reunited with their youth. And most of those folks, most of those women and femmes were in prison because of domestic and sexual violence related stuff. So they were survivors and they had been incarcerated somehow related to their experience as a survivor, whether it was like coping mechanisms that they had that are criminalized or having, you know, sought safety by self-defense or whatever it was. And then of course they were harmed even more while incarcerated. And then they were also unfortunately harmed even more by the sort of criminal or carceral logic of the nonprofit that I worked for that I ended up leaving pretty quickly. And so you could just see the cycle continuing in that way. And that, as you were mentioning, like the harm doesn't magically arise in in families or in communities. It's really rooted in violence that's already occurred for centuries, and in a system that criminalizes certain folks more than others, or forces folks into situations where they find ways of coping that are super valid, but that are criminalized in our culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the thing that popped up for me immediately is just thinking about like sex workers, specifically like trans sex workers, like, the violence of not being able to, like a lot of the folks that I've worked with and that I know feel like sex work has become like an only option for them. Um, that is not to say that some people don't choose sex work, because a lot of people do because it's lucrative. But like it doesn't come without its risks, right? So it's like, trans women have a really hard time of finding employment, and so then turn to sex work. Once they experience, if they experience violence during sex work, like then having to turn around to interact with the police potentially to report said violence, or be re-traumatized again through the lack of attention, lack of care, lack of rigor put into actually seeking justice for them. So I'm like, we can see this happen like over and over and over and over again. I mean, it is a very complicated thing, I think, when we're having conversations just like with people that I know amongst ourselves. And it's like the level of violence that Black trans women face, like a lot of the conversation, well, we should just lock those folks up and, that'll be the end of it. But it's like, we could lock up a lot of people that might have committed acts of violence against trans women, but how do we lock up the state, right? Like, how do we actually prevent that harm from happening? And that is like, I mean, I think that's one of my favorite conversations to have. I think it's a really hard conversation, mainly because everyone imagines like abolitionists are going to have every idea planned out, like a whole like book, a handbook, or something like that. And it's like, to be thinking towards like abolition is to be deep in a process of decolonization, which means like thinking through like punishment and things like that. Even that word, just like, I don't even like that word, like punishment. Like no one needs to be punished for anything. Like, you know, I like, yeah, I just think it's really exciting to imagine what we envision for our world when harm happens, when conflict comes up, and how does that actually play out. And I think that there are folks who are doing some really, really important work around like addressing harm. Like I don't know if folks are familiar with thinking it through like pod mapping. Like I don't know if you've heard that term before, but like pod mapping, I think, is one of the best ways that we can start practicing some of those values, and like divesting from the prison industrial complex and come back to traditional practices of dealing with harm and conflict the way that our ancestors did, which is through compassion and understanding and recognizing like the dignity of all people involved. Like I think this distancing away from criminals and crime and all of that is really just a fear of that someday that's going to be us, and we're going to be on the outside at the next point, you know?
Yeah, I want to talk more about like working towards envisioning outside of carceral feminism, but I wanted to ask you first, like, what are some of the ways that carceral feminism has impacted you or survivors that you've known? And particularly, I'm thinking about like what are you hearing, especially from like minority and marginalized folks, about why that's not serving them, or maybe it's actively harming them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think you made a good point earlier, but I think like a lot of the times when we experience violence, it's by people that we know, like that is just the way that things tend to work out. And I think, it's really hard to, you know, like turn the police on somebody you actually care about. I think for the folks in my community that we know, a lot of that time that's like partners who might have like mental health problems, or it might be relatives that also they themselves have experienced sexual violence. So it's like we could, I think people are really challenged by, the same folks who are like committing genocide against our people, looking to them for safety. I think that ultimately what happens is that even though that's not usually the first option they want to go to, that's usually what's available. And it's like as an abolitionist, I don't tell people to not call the police, because I think that people who experience harm will reach out and do whatever they feel that they need to do. Like I'm not in a position to dictate that for anybody. um but I do think that it's really challenging to um turn to those folks for safety when they actually can't. They show up after harm has happened. And it's like, what safety can they actually provide? And I think that is the challenge there too. I think there are I forget the name, but there is an emergency response team that I think is going to be rolled out pretty recently, or already has been rolling out pretty recently, which I think is great. But it's just like one little piece um to a puzzle where there's thousands of people in the city. We have to really, really think through like what are um the possibilities for us, or what are the policies, or where can we shift resources to have more of that. There was the budget hearing for the city. I'm aware of where the policing budget will be spent, how that will be spent. And I think that would be a great opportunity for folks to kind of like roll into that and focus on like what we want, the world that we're trying to build, and also pulling resources away from the systems that are causing us the most harm as well.
I see that we have the option to take a break. I'm fine either way. What feels good to you, Babatunde?
I'm good. I'm
Yeah,
in
okay, let's keep going.
like, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking of when you were talking about, I really, really resonate with everything you said, including what you were talking about at the end, and how there's so little funding put into prevention. And that was leading me to thinking about profit, right? And that like prevention isn't isn't as profitable as prisons. And the sort of role that profit plays in the decision making around where we put our resources, which I think really there's a hidden desire, right, to like perpetuate. If harm keeps happening, then there's going to continue to be profit, and that's like an unfortunate driver. I also think I agree with you that I certainly have known many survivors who wanted punishment for their abuser or wanted to go through the criminal justice system. And I wonder what they would have thought if there were other options. And I also have known many, many survivors, particularly in marginalized communities, who, similar to what you're saying, did not want that option because they wanted healing, because they had shared family with that abuser and wanted that family to still be able to have contact safely with that person. even if they themselves didn't want to have contact. They didn't want to perpetuate state harm in their communities by bringing those systems into their communities, even if it would bring them personal relief in some way, which we know, right, that it doesn't. Like the amount of survivors I've worked with and the percentage of them that actually experienced some kind of successful prosecution is pretty minimal.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's an accident. I think that's also baked into the system. I don't think that's something that reform is going to make better.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's part of the way things work. So I just don't see justice happening that way. And I don't hear survivors saying that they experience healing. And so many of us have seen, right, that like when abusers are incarcerated or when they are pushed out of a community, that then that person just goes on to harm in a different community. So even if you're only looking at it, you know, I certainly would look at it as the abuser is also a human.
Mm-hmm.
But even if you're only looking at it from the survivor's perspective or safety, a perspective of safety, it's not offering that. And survivors know that, and they don't feel safe. They continue to not feel safe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm curious if you could name any like ways you've seen survivors or folks that experience violence keep themselves safe that don't rely on like carceral systems.
I think I really became aware that that was a reality. I think that's always happening all the time. And I think even within systems, you know, I work in a nonprofit, which is somewhat systems adjacent, right? And has its pros and cons. Even in our work, I think advocates and survivors are doing that all the time without realizing it, which is actually really great and inspiring. I think I first became consciously aware of alternatives and transformative justice as a young activist in punk community where community callouts were happening. There were opportunities for survivors to speak directly to the community about what had happened to them, and there was an assumption of belief.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, this was in my early 20s, there were also men's groups forming to try to address toxic masculinity within activist communities and do work together, and also form groups to hold accountable. I did some work with Philly's Pissed and Philly Stands Up, and was seeing like the ways that communities are like building survivor support and also accountability processes for people who've done harm. Those were often really messy, but another way that I see alternatives already happening is just that many of the survivors we work with in the nonprofit industrial complex are also abusers, are also harmers, right? Like many of the survivors I've worked with over my 20 years of work abused their own children. And we were not kicking those people to the police. We were not throwing them out of our programs. We're working with them with the recognition that like their experiences have informed the harm they're doing and that their kids still want them and want them well. So I think these are ways in which like we're already doing this work. But sometimes we don't even know we're doing it. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we've been sold this lie that it's not possible, that it's never going to work, but we're already doing it, right? We're like flyering about abusers in our community, if that's a way to keep safe. We're creating phone trees to offer people in our communities safety and support. We're like organizing mutual aid for survivors to bring them food and childcare. These are things that are happening all the time, but we're not necessarily gifted with special names for them by the systems that run the world. And so we don't always notice that. What about you? What are some things that you've seen or participated in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially in like just art alternative communities, like, you know, be it punks, anarchists, queers, trans folks, like I think that just we have a general distaste for the police, I might say. Like, but I think that, yeah, definitely in our communities, I've seen like a lot of sharing and storytelling that's happening. like what you were saying, you know, just today, even like on social media, you know, there's like these two people have been had abuse accusations. Like, let's talk about it, you know. And it's more of like a conversation and less of like, okay, well, we're all gonna drop this person, you know. I will say I feel like that has started to be more of the practice, whereas like a few years ago, I don't think that was necessarily the case. I feel like we were more on the um less on the transformational side and more like leaning into the punishments, like that
Yeah.
person's canceled, that person's canceled, that person's
Yeah.
canceled, you know. And all of that, I think is rooted in that fear piece, you know. Her folks are like, well, I don't want it to be me, so let's just push this person as far away as possible, you know. um and yeah, I think heavy with the mutual aid. Like mutual aid has been the lifeblood of our communities for a really long time. And I think it's just now starting to be something that like has become more central and dominant to the conversation out of necessity because of everything that's happening right now. Um, but yeah, I really excited that you mentioned the Philly Stands Up work because yeah, it was really, really inspirational work. I know that I have uh, gone to a few like just practice trainings with Mariam Kaba and Shira Hussein that have been like super amazing around like kind of just understanding like there's layers to meeting folks' needs when it actually comes to like seeking justice. So not just like, okay, well, we've addressed this with this person. It's like this person's gonna need healing, this person's gonna need support, this person's gonna need somebody to call at 2 a.m. when they're having a panic attack, you know? And I think that those are the ways that like we are already taking care of each other. Like exactly like you said, we don't have words for them. It's just like the care that we extend to each other in community on a regular basis.
One thing that I got really excited about when your bio was being read that I wanted to ask you about is the disability justice and somatic work that you do. And I
Mhm.
wanted to ask you, do you see body, do you see like work that centers the physical body as in opposition to carceral logic?
Mm.
And if so, like, why is that work important to like transformation, transformative justice, and pushing against
Mhm.
carceral feminism?
Yeah, I mean, I think the carceral system itself just kind of like has you in this space of like trying to just like intellect or think through things enough that it can just like rationalize it. But I think my experience with disability justice and generative somatics is like it's hard to punish someone when you are in touch with your body, you know, which I know might be like a loaded thing to say, but that's my experience. Like, I feel like I have had um, more understanding and have been able to achieve like more comprehension around abolition as like a practice and like a daily practice and a goal. And I think that it's hard to um, move through things when you're very, very just what am I trying to say? When you're very detached from yourself as well as detached from other people. You know, like I think that what we experience as our bodies and how we um, move within our bodies and you know, live within our bodies is exactly how we kind of like treat other folks, you know. So for example, like I know that part of my decolonization has been to really get to terms with like, you know, having a disability, really get to terms with my body being different. You know, my body's bigger than some people's, you know, I can't do certain things like other people, you know, and I think that acknowledging those differences within ourselves makes it easier to acknowledge those differences in other people, you know. It's like the difference between thinking about, oh, that person is just like being wild and screaming on the street, better call the cops, versus, okay, that person might be having a mental health thing going on right now. I should maybe go down and check, or maybe see if the other folks in my neighborhood want to go check with me, you know? And I think that makes a huge difference. I think the piece around disability justice is just like, with that, we can't do anything alone, period, you know? And so people are, I'd even say more valuable for folks that are like disabled, because it's like, we have to rely upon each other. It's not so easy to just be like, well, I'm good. I, that person, those people can go in jail. Those people are disposable, you know? Like, I think that getting in touch with the body really means that, like, can help to understand, um, like, we're all flawed. We're all flawed. We all come with like our own shit. We all come with like ancestral trauma. We all come with like the violence that we experience every day. A lot of us come out of poverty. A lot of come out of an active genocide on indigenous folks and black folks. And so there's a lot there. There is definitely a lot going on there. So I think that the body is definitely one of the sources of liberation. And I'm really glad that you brought that up in having this conversation as well, because I feel like it's one of the things that people forget about. I feel like we try to think our way through everything. And like, honestly, these days, I'm more about feeling into stuff than thinking through it. And I think that that's kind of the shift of the carceral state too. You know, like liberation is the feeling into things. The carceral state is the thinking through things and putting the right numbers. If we just get this science right, we can just, you know, the system won't be so bad. Like that's where the reformist thinking comes from, you know, for me. And I just like, yeah.
I resonate with that so much. I definitely was thinking about the disposability of bodies in capitalism and in the carceral state, thinking about those firefighters, imprisoned firefighters in California, and how disposable those bodies are, right? Which is just like one example. And I love what you're saying about how like getting in touch with your body helps you feel that you're not disposable. But also I liked what you were saying about it. When you're in touch with your body, you notice your interconnectedness and that there is no other, right? Like, and you can't punish or dispose of somebody if you're truly in touch with how interconnected everything is. Doesn't mean there's not consequences for somebody who's harmed. Doesn't mean you need to be in direct relationship with that person if that's what's going to make you feel safe. But recognizing that there is that interconnectedness, and that's definitely been my experience in Brown Girl Rise. One of the great things about organizing with Brown Girl Rise has been that we do the work in an embodied way and from a point of feeling. So, you know, harm happens everywhere. It's happened in our collective.
Mhm.
And one of the ways we've approached that is from an embodied place. Because I think it allows for healing for the person who's been harmed. It also allows for accountability for the harmer. As somebody who's done harm, when I get in touch with my body, I'm getting in touch with like a true accounting of how I've harmed.
Mhm.
And there's no running away from it because it's living right there in my body. So I agree with you. I think that like bringing the body into the work we're doing in the search for justice and healing is absolutely necessary. So I'm really glad to hear you share about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just like the conversation around bodies is really, really important, because it's like, you know, our Black bodies are like seen as disposable and consumable, you know, trans bodies, indigenous bodies, like all disabled bodies, like, you know, I think that our bodies often become a point of either privilege or contention, just in our like everyday lives. So I think to completely ignore that feeds into like a carceral state, like having us detached from the thing that really connects us most, which is like the air that we all breathe, the water that we all drink, the land that we are all on, the occupied the occupied land that we're on, like, you know. But yeah, I definitely agree with you. Like being in touch, like when harm happens, there's a person who's harmed, but it also definitely harms the person who's enacting the harm. Like I go back to that a lot because I think that was probably one of the hardest things for me in like my journey as an abolitionist, and as a survivor, you know, um, to acknowledge that the person who caused harm also experienced harm themselves, you know. Yeah, I could talk about that all day. Like it's one of the hardest things though, and I think it's one of the questions that always comes up when we're talking about abolition is like, well, what do we do with all the rapists and the murderers? Oh, my cat says hi. But yeah, I mean, I think that those type of questions just blow my mind because I'm like, well, what about like the colonizers? Like, what about the imperialists? What about the people that are like making money off of like death and destruction of this land and our people? You know, like no one seems to be that concerned about them. Like, and at the same time, I'm like, I'm not fighting for a future where we're just gonna throw those folks in jail either, because I'm like, that doesn't get us anywhere.
Yeah, it really relies on this idea that you can do one thing, like punish somebody, and then the work is done, instead of recognizing that things are in process all the time. Which I think a lot of that for me also comes from disability justice, like that things are in process all the time, and that we're living in complexity all the time, as people who harm and are harmed. That there's never going to be a sort of a black and white us or them kind of solution to anything. And this idea that like anyone can ever escape the harm that's done by the state, right? Like that's kind of the lie that we're fed, is that if we manage to make it into the privileged group, or if we stay in the victim role and never get named as the perpetrator, like that we're ever going to be able to escape the harm, is I think part of the fallacy that we're sold. And I think survivors know this all too well, particularly survivors with marginalized identities, is that like no one escapes, and the harm is already always happening. And that to be distracted by the state all the time, to just focusing on these individual acts of harm versus the system, is how it is perpetuated.
I totally agree with that. Let me see. I think we have a question. Are there any organizations, collectives that you look to that model non-carceral practices and approaches to addressing harm?
Yeah, well, we talked a little bit about Philly's Pissed and Philly Stands Up, which I feel like were the first organizations that were actually organizations and not just communities trying to do work inside themselves, which is also super awesome and valid. That I saw doing that type of work. I think we've been talking about disability justice and how it intersects with transformative justice, and I have to definitely give a shout out to Sins Invalid as an organization that I think has been really foundational in so much thinking around care, community care and healing, and accountability. I also have been really excited lately about the work that API Chaya is doing up in Seattle. They're a culturally specific organization that does domestic and sexual violence work, and they've been teaching transformative justice principles for a long time. But I know recently they started a project to they were teaching kind of like what is transformative justice, but they've recently started a project to actually build skills in communities where people can then lead community accountability processes themselves, which I think is something that's really lacking. I think there's a lot of what is transformative justice workshops out there, which is great, but people are still really hungry for the actual hands-on skills of like, okay, I'm seeing harm in my communities. What do I do? So I'm really excited about that project. And it's something that I hope I get to see all over the country, but definitely in Portland. I think it's something that we're missing as folks are trying to navigate harm in their own communities. They're really looking for that kind of work. What about you, Babatunde? Have you seen, who are you admiring these days?
Every time there's a just practice training, I go. I think I've done a couple in New York, but based out of Seattle as well. Definitely like they are bringing, I think, a lot of the one-on-ones, but also like going through and doing like a full process with folks. I think that just practice is great, mainly because a lot of folks are coming to like the transformative justice work really eager and wanting to learn a lot. And then the other piece of that is that actually the learning comes through the practice, which I think is really, really great. I think I would echo you as well around Sins Invalid, like one of my favorite organizations. And just honestly, like I follow people on Instagram all the time, but like Mia Mingus is just like so brilliant, like so brilliant. Like I think the work that they've been doing in Oakland, the organization is escaping me now, brain fog. But yeah, the work that they've been doing has just like the intersect the it's just really refreshing to have a conversation around transformative justice and care and accountability, and have that conversation also be included around like disability, because I feel like that disability justice also is tied to all of these other systems as well, but it's one of those things that I feel like people consistently disregard when it comes to thinking through like the prison industrial complex, abolition, like dismantling these systems, and also like even the conversations around like who is targeted by the police, and a lot of the times those folks are disabled people. I think there's to the date still no national database around the violence that happens to disabled people in terms of like police violence. And I'm like, it's 2020. That's kind of shocking, right? Like in these times that is still not being prioritized. But I'm totally getting down a rabbit hole at this point. But yeah, also Project Nia. Miriam Kaba is so brilliant, and I love that the work also again is like centered around like young people and getting justice for young folks, because I think that I mean, just with youth work and the work that I've done, like people consistently disregard the humanity of young people. It's like, oh, these are just children. It's like, no, these are actual human beings who feel things exactly like we do, probably in more intensity because they're not jaded yet. Like, but yeah, I just am really excited about thinking through back to the start of our conversation, how we can use transformative justice as a platform to have more practice opportunities in schools, have more practice opportunities with like young folks seeking accountability from like adults, you know? Yeah, I think, who else? Yeah, I'll stop there because I'm like, I think we're winding down on time.
Those are some really exciting examples. I think Corey said Barrier Justice, Transformative Justice
That's it.
Collective.
Yes. Thanks, Corey.
Is who Mia Mingus is involved with. Is that
Mm-hmm.
correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at our last question here that was one of the things that we could think about, which is, what do you envision as a more just way to address harm that does not perpetuate the continuum of violence experienced by QT BIPOC?
A more just way to address harm. I would say making sure that however the harm is being addressed, that it's like survivor focused, you know, and oriented to less of like this is the rubric about how we address harm. You know, I think that people get really comfortable and like there's one way to do things, and I think that if we are able to tap into that like abolitionist feel, that abolitionist spirit that lives in every single one of us, because police did not exist. Like, and there was a time police did not exist, so we know it's possible. It's in our bodies. We know it's possible. Um, but getting to understand that, like, the ways that we respond to harm are always going to be different. Every time it's going to be different. There's not one single recipe that's going to work, because harm happens all different types of ways, and we're all very different types of people. I think that one of the other ways that I envision that is just if we're addressing harm, like we also have to think through, like, again, the transformative justice, like how did this harm happen? What are the events that happened to let this harm happen? So thinking through, someone stole like $150 from you, you know what I'm saying? And it's like, okay, well, let's address that. This person didn't have a place to stay. This person didn't have food. This person didn't have clothing, or like whatever they might have needed. Like, I think when it comes to queer and trans BIPOC folks, like we should be really thinking, well, I would want for us to really be thinking through, like, what are the tangible needs that aren't being met that cause the harm to happen? You know, I think for everyone, but particularly for queer and trans folks, because we're already so marginalized and already experience high levels of trauma and harm and aggressions and all kinds of things. Like, we really have to look kind of like a wraparound service type, like what is it that's needed, you know? And yeah, I just think about, like, just keep coming back to like mutuality, dignity, respect, you know, all around, like for everyone, you know, like just because bad things happen um doesn't mean that we get to like be the cops. It doesn't mean that we get to be the punishers, the enforcers, you know? It's like, I think that when I envision this, I'm like, and we're doing like these practices and having these circles, like I always envision like this the saying that people have and been saying, but it's like kill the cop that's in your head, you know? And that is deep. That is some real deep stuff when we're actually thinking about it, you know? It's like embedded in all of our social media, our movies, our books, everything is that like the state will protect you, an eye for an eye. Well, if somebody did this to me, I want them to go to jail so they can get raped, you know? Like that I want us to get to a point where we are creating spaces where we can actually, if even for a little while, like take that out of our system and really begin to imagine what else is possible, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, I think piggybacking off of that, I would love to see a world where um, resources to address harm aren't hoarded by nonprofits and by the
Mm,
government. Like, I work at a nonprofit, and I would love a world where rather than being the experts on trauma and helping survivors, we're just we're we're there as like maybe a support for communities to do their own work. So, you know, we funnel, because I think what you're naming is that like different communities and different cultures have different ways of addressing harm
mhm,
that are going to be what works best for them, what works best for the survivor, what works best for that culture, what works best for that group of people, which is why culturally specific stuff is so important, right?
mhm,
Because culture heals, and we need people to have the tool. We need to support the tools people already have to do what's best for their own communities. I'd love to see a world in which, you know, there were more programs like API Chaya's where it's like, we're here just to be like people to bounce ideas off of, or to like pour money into you guys, and then you guys can do what you want to do with that money that makes sense for your community, because you're the experts, rather than trying to hoard those funds ourselves. And then the cycle just continues. And like you said, there's no addressing of sort of the root causes that are leading to these things in the first place. So that's something that I would really like to see change, and that I really imagine being different in the future. I think, like we talked about, people already know a lot more than they think they know about how to help themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And if they could just get some damn money in their hands or resources in their hands, then they would be able to go forward. And I would also like to see a lot more support put into prevention, because I think there's more of a desire for a quick fix than the real work takes. I see that we have some questions. I can read the first one. It says, how do you recommend dealing with patterns of harm in community, ongoing and continued harm with no willingness to engage in accountability?
Sorry, I'm like reading the question. Yeah. I mean, I guess my response to that question is like, with patterns of harm, ongoing continued harm, I think that there has to be a larger conversation about like how the community wants to respond to this. And you know, maybe if this person is in a leadership role or something, like they need to step away, you know, like, or if there are like, you know, somebody is being super misogynist, are there folks that are practicing healthy masculinity that can intervene, you know? I think after so many times and the harm just continues to happen, like there has to be a deeper community engagement to actually address that. You know, I think that in a perfect world, we'd imagine like someone's like got some support, got some help, and they're like, okay, wow, I'm never gonna do that again. But that is just not the reality. Like harm, like you said, happens all the time, you know, often multiple times, like, you know, and so I think it's just like gauging the response needed from the community and reaching out to folks to actually like make sure that there's can be some sort of like healing or addressing that actually happens there.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, you know, you mentioned earlier, Babatunde, like the work needs to continue to be survivor centered. And I absolutely believe that if there's a safety issue and a harmer is refusing to engage in any way, that you can then focus on whatever you need to do to keep that survivor safe, and that is acceptable. So, I mean, we may not even, I think the more the community is engaged in the accountability process, the less likely it is that an abuser has anywhere to run away to. But of course, that's not the reality of where we're at a lot of the time right now. Like a person may be very much harbored by the community. So even if there's a small group within the community who's trying to do transformative justice, the larger community may still be protecting the abuser. And I think if that's the case, then there are times, at least right now, where the most you can do is just focus on how you keep that survivor safe and help them heal the way that makes sense for them. I see this comment, which I think is really relevant, Babatunde, that says, the biggest barrier I find in my community to actually healing harm and undertaking accountability processes is that everyone is tired, struggling, and a survivor themselves. What steps can we take to move slowly beyond this to build restorative justice in smaller and/or rural communities with fewer resources?
Yeah, I mean, I think to that comment, I would say if everyone's tired, go even slower, honestly. Like on it, a lot of these like transformative justice and community accountability process they're never quick. I mean, some are, but a lot of them take years, like years, 2, 3 years to actually go through all of the steps to make it happen. And I think that's another part of like the carceral state is thinking that, oh, we can just do this thing and, you know, it's going to be over and done with. But actual transformation and healing and all of that stuff takes a lot of time. Um, I think in terms of like being a person who is rurally located, I think like reaching out to like local folks or whatever the nearest major city and getting some recommendations, because I feel like often there are kind of like crews of people that do this work that are really excited to have more people to do this work, especially like restorative justice type stuff. And I think that, you know, reaching out would, I would hope that somebody would be able to provide some resources. But I think if not, the organizations that we've mentioned have a lot of resources available, like online, that could actually be helpful as well. If you're not able to actually get someone to provide some support to y'all rurally.
I just want a t-shirt now that says go even slower because I think that's fantastic. And I do agree that we don't often give ourselves permission for that. The only thing I would add, because I think everything you said was awesome, Babatunde, is maybe consider having some circles of care. So, you know, I think one thing that's worked in communities I've worked in with all kinds of burnout issues is having layers of care. So if you have like maybe the main folks who are keeping the accountability process going, then like those folks need to have their own care circle. They may need to have their own care circle of people who are bringing them dinner or doing support work for them, because all kinds of work needs support. Like vicarious trauma and burnout are so real, especially I've seen that a lot too. I really identify with that question. So going slower, as Babatunde said, and then making sure that there's multiple layers of care happening, so that you yourself are also getting that support.
Beautifully said.
I'm curious if there are any other questions from anybody. So there's another question here. Super curious about your thoughts on transformative justice and addressing harm experienced by very young people, like early childhood. I think we have about 5 more minutes to chat.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, introducing restorative justice as soon as possible, transformative justice as soon as possible is great, because at a young age, I feel like it gives young folks that much more agency and autonomy, you know, and actually being able to address the harms that happen to them. Um, you know, I think that there's inherently a dynamic with like very small children and big adults, you know, that they're looking to folks that they always know what's right, they always know what's best. And we know that's not the fucking case. That's not the case at all. Like complete opposite. And I think it's important to empower children with a sense of like being able to say, that was wrong and that happened to me, and how are we going to address this harm that happened to me, you know? I think it's especially important, particularly with young femme children, you know? I think it's especially important there because I feel like femmes in particular are, the way our society is set up is just like, you have no agency, that's not your body, that's our body, you know, that's, you have no autonomy, you go where we tell you to go, you know? And I think that giving more of that empowerment, embodiment to younger children is like really honestly radical and beautiful. Like when I've seen it done and it happens, it's like, wow, that child called their parent out and we're like, you harmed me, or called this person out. I'm like, wow, I wish that I had that when I was a child. You know, I'm like, I'm sure that things would have been definitely very different for me and my experiences if I had more agency and autonomy much earlier, or I had that sense of that much earlier.
I would just add to that that knowing that that might be another process that's super long, because, you know, healing, when you experience harm as a child, healing happens like over a lifetime in terms of like developmental stages. I feel like, you know, I've seen so many kids go through a process at 3 and then need to go through a new process at 6 as their brain has grown, and go through another process at 12 as their brain grows again. And so that could really be for the adults in their life an ongoing process as they age, because a 3-year-old is going to have a very different understanding of what's happening than they're able to have at the age of 12 or 20 or 30. And that's going to be a part of the process, is growing with them and being ready to readdress the harm as aging happens. I think we're at time. It was so nice to speak with you.
Sorry, I'm on mute. You as well. You as well. This is a very great conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Claire and Babatunde, for joining us. We're just so glad you both were able to join in this conversation, which I think is such an important one, especially with the uprising that has been happening. A lot of folks are like, what does this mean? What does it mean when we're having conversations about defunding and abolition? And what does that mean on a personal level for the violence I'm experiencing, maybe in my own home, right? In my own maybe queer and trans community, right? Like, how does that apply? How does all that trickle down? And so I just want to thank you all for just giving context and bringing perspective to all of that for us. And yeah, we hope that we'll see y'all again. We'll have other opportunities to connect and partner with the Women's Resource Center. Thank you to all of our attendees for being here. Please remember to register for our next event coming up this Tuesday, 5:30 p.m. to 7 o'clock p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We're having our second conversation in the series on Black feminism with our former WRC employee, Ebony Oldham, founder of the Black Feminist Kitchen, and Naomi Lowe. It's going to be great. We hope to see y'all there. Please tell your friends, tell your aunties, tell all your people to attend. Yeah, thanks. Again, I want to thank our captioner, Julene, Kaylin, our ASL interpreter. It was lovely to see you again. All of the WRC staff. I see some other PSU folks here with us this evening. Thank you for coming. This conversation was live streamed on YouTube, and I believe you should be able to go back to the PSU WRC YouTube channel to see it. And we also have recorded it as well. Thanks, y'all. We'll see you soon.